Most of us have something in our house that we don't really think about. Not something valuable, not something important, just something. A box on a shelf, an old item in a closet, something you've walked past 100 times without looking at twice. And the reason it never scares us is simple. It doesn't move. As human beings, we fear movement. We fear noise. We fear things that chase us, threaten us, or show intention. We don't fear stillness. We don't fear objects. But if you look back at the worst moments of your life, you'll probably realize something uncomfortable. Most of them didn't begin with danger. They began with curiosity, a decision that felt harmless, a choice you didn't think would matter, a moment where you told yourself, it's probably nothing. That's how this story begins. Not with screaming, not with violence, not with anything supernatural announcing itself. It begins with a box, small, wooden, ordinary, the kind of object you would never imagine could change your life. And that's exactly why it did. In 2001, a man named Kevin Mannis attended an estate sale in Portland, Oregon. Kevin was an antiques dealer. Buying old things was his job. Forgotten furniture, inherited items, belongings left behind by people who were no longer alive. History didn't bother him. Death didn't bother him. Old energy didn't bother him. Everything had a price. The estate belonged to an elderly woman who had recently passed away. She was a Holocaust survivor. Her family was clearing the house, selling what they could, trying to move on. That's when Kevin noticed the box. It was a small wooden wine cabinet, darkened with age, handcrafted, heavier than it looked. Nothing about it was particularly beautiful, but something about it felt deliberate. When Kevin asked about it, the mood in the room shifted. The woman's granddaughter immediately became distressed. She told him the box was never meant to be sold, that it had caused pain, that it should never be opened. Kevin assumed grief was talking. People attach emotions to objects after loss. He had seen it countless times. He bought the box anyway. That night, he brought it back to his shop and placed it on a table. Nothing happened. No noises, no movement, no immediate fear, just silence. Kevin went home and went to sleep. That was the first night he dreamed of the woman. She was old. Her face was twisted, not with rage, but with something deeper, betrayal. She screamed in a language Kevin didn't understand, her voice raw and desperate. He woke up gasping for air. The smell in the room hit him immediately. Urine, strong, fresh, not his. The next morning, Kevin laughed it off. Stress, bad dreams, coincidence. He had work to do. Later that day, he gave the box to his mother as a birthday gift. Within hours of touching it, she suffered a massive stroke. Doctors couldn't explain it. Kevin took the box back. That's when the pattern began. Lights flickered only in rooms where the box was present. His dog refused to enter the shop, growling at the closed door. The same sour bodily smell appeared randomly and vanished without explanation. Still, Kevin didn't believe the box itself was responsible, so he opened it. Inside were items that made no sense together. 2 old pennies, a dried rosebud, a lock of blonde hair tied with string, a small golden wine goblet, and a black stone etched with unfamiliar symbols. That night, Kevin experienced sleep paralysis for the first time in his life. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. He felt pressure on his chest and the unmistakable sensation of something close to his face. Then he heard his name. When he woke up, there were 3 scratches on his arm, perfectly parallel. Kevin sold the box online. The buyer contacted him days later in panic. Nightmares, illness, the smell, a figure standing in his bedroom at night. He begged Kevin to take it back. Kevin refused. The box was sold again, and every owner reported the same progression: discomfort, dreams, fear, loss. Eventually, the box reached Jason Haxton, a medical museum director who didn't believe in curses, only documentation. And that's where the story stopped being about a box and started being about what happens when attention becomes a doorway. Jason Haxton didn't feel fear when he first received the box. What he felt was curiosity mixed with responsibility. As a museum director, he had handled items connected to disease, war, and death. Objects that carried history didn't intimidate him. He believed meaning came from context, not mysticism. When the box arrived, sealed and unassuming, his first thought wasn't danger, it was documentation. He placed it on a work table under proper lighting and took photographs. Measurements, notes, weight. wood type, construction style, nothing unusual on the surface. But he noticed something subtle almost immediately. The room felt closed, not smaller, not darker, closed, as if the air itself had decided not to move. Within hours, Jason developed a headache that didn't respond to medication. By the evening, his eyes burned as if he hadn't slept in days. He assumed strain, dehydration, stress. That night, he dreamed of standing inside a narrow wooden space. The walls pressed close on all sides. He could feel the grain of the wood against his palms. The air was stale, recycled, barely breathable. Somewhere outside the box, a woman was crying. Not loudly, resigned. When Jason woke up, the headache was worse. Over the next few days, the symptoms escalated. A constant sense of dread followed him, unrelated to any thought or situation. His sleep fractured into short, restless segments. When he did sleep, the dreams returned. Always confined, always watched, always waiting. Jason began researching the word associated with the box. Dybbuk. In Jewish folklore, a Dybbuk is described as a restless spirit that clings to the living. But the deeper Jason read, the more uncomfortable the definitions became. A Dybbuk wasn't simply a ghost. It was an entity formed through unresolved trauma, guilt, or violent displacement. Some texts described it as a soul that had lost its path. Others implied something older, something that learned how to use human suffering as shelter. One description stood out. A Dybbuk seeks a vessel not to escape pain, but to continue existing. That reframed everything. Jason returned to the box with new eyes. He noticed faint Hebrew inscriptions carved into the wood, nearly invisible under normal light. The craftsmanship wasn't decorative, it was functional. This wasn't a container, it was a boundary. Jason contacted religious scholars, rabbis, historians. Many declined to help the moment he mentioned the box. Others warned him not to pursue further study. One rabbi spoke briefly and said something that unsettled Jason deeply. Some things are not meant to be understood, only maintained. Jason didn't listen. He attempted a cleansing ritual based on fragmented texts and guidance from those willing to speak cautiously. The ritual wasn't aggressive. It wasn't confrontational. It was meant to quiet. Within days, Jason's health collapsed. His organs began failing without explanation. Doctors couldn't identify a cause. Treatments didn't help. His body behaved as if it were rejecting itself. Only when the box was sealed again did his condition stabilize. That correlation was impossible to ignore. Jason realized something critical. The box didn't respond to challenge. It responded to disturbance. And disturbance didn't require hostility. It only required attention. Jason began tracking not just physical symptoms, but timing. He noticed spikes in activity whenever the box was discussed intensely. Interviews, articles, private conversations. Emotion mattered. Fear amplified it. Mockery amplified it. Curiosity amplified it most of all. The Dybbuk didn't want to be freed. It wanted to be acknowledged. That distinction changed everything, because acknowledgement is participation, and participation doesn't end when the object is sealed. Jason started noticing reports from people who had never touched the box, people who had only read about it, listened to podcasts, watched videos, heard the story secondhand. They reported similar dreams, confinement, pressure, a sense of being observed by something patient. The common factor wasn't proximity, it was exposure. That's when Jason began to suspect the box was no longer the primary vessel. It was the origin point, the anchor. The story itself had become a container, and stories don't stay locked in one place. They move, they adapt, they wait for attention. Replica Dybbuk boxes began appearing online around this time. Some were built as art pieces, others as pranks. Many were opened on camera. Most people laughed at first. Then some of them stopped laughing. Reports surfaced of sleep paralysis, sudden illness, mood changes. Not possession, not dramatic manifestations. Subtle shifts, paranoia, fixation, anxiety that felt borrowed. Jason watched this pattern unfold and felt something colder than fear. Recognition. The Dybbuk didn't need the original box anymore. It needed belief. And belief spreads faster than wood ever could. Jason sealed the original box again, using a ritual designed not to expel, but to suppress. Ancient texts referred to it as a form of containment through continuity, a promise. As long as the boundary remained intact, as long as the story was treated with caution, the entity would remain dormant. Dormant isn't gone. Dormant means waiting. Jason stopped speaking publicly about the box after that, not out of fear of ridicule, but because he noticed something alarming. Every time he tried to stop thinking about it, something drew his thoughts back, not forcefully, gently, like a suggestion. Just one more look, just one more explanation, just one more attempt to understand. He understood then that curiosity wasn't neutral. It was a doorway, and doorways don't need to be kicked in. They only need to be left unlocked. Jason chose silence. But silence doesn't erase a story. It only slows its spread. And as long as someone hears it, as long as someone imagines it, as long as someone wonders whether it could be real, the boundary holds. But it strains. And that strain is what people feel. That pressure, that discomfort, that sense that something is unfinished. Because it is. The Dybbuk Box was never meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be watched. And the moment no one is watching, that's when containment fails. Jason began to notice something else that disturbed him more than the physical symptoms. The box reacted differently to different people. Some experienced fear immediately, panic, nightmares, a desire to get away from it as fast as possible. Others felt something else entirely. Attraction, not fascination, not curiosity. Attraction, they described it as a pull, a quiet urge to stay near it, to look at it longer than necessary, to think about it when they were away from it. Jason recognized that pattern from the texts. Dybbuks don't attach to the strongest people. They attach to the most receptive ones, people who are searching for answers, people who feel unresolved, people who carry quiet guilt or grief. The box didn't create cracks. It found them. Jason reviewed reports from previous owners more carefully now, not just what happened to them, but who they were at the time. One man had recently lost his wife. Another was recovering from addiction. Another was facing financial collapse. Stress alone didn't explain it. Transition did. Moments where identity weakens. Moments where the mind becomes flexible. Those are entry points. Jason began to believe the Dybbuk wasn't interested in harm for its own sake. Harm was a byproduct. What it wanted was continuity of existence, and existence requires a place to settle. That idea changed how he interpreted the dreams, the confinement, the pressure, the desperation. Those weren't threats. They were memories. Jason suspected the entity had once been bound against its will, sealed not because it was evil, but because it was dangerous in the way a wildfire is dangerous, uncontained. But something else became clear. Whatever was sealed inside the box had learned. It had adapted to modern conditions. It no longer relied solely on physical proximity. It used narrative. It used repetition. It used attention. Jason began experimenting carefully, almost reluctantly. He reduced all documentation, stopped writing, stopped speaking, stopped even thinking about the box intentionally. The effects diminished, but they never vanished completely. They lingered at the edges of awareness. A tightness in the chest when the room was too quiet. A sense of being observed when he was alone with his thoughts. Dreams that returned if he spent too long reflecting on the past. Jason realized something unsettling. Containment didn't require constant action. It required restraint. The Dybbuk didn't need to escape dramatically. It only needed someone to keep the door open. And doors don't always look like doors. Sometimes they look like interest. Sometimes they look like skepticism. Sometimes they look like entertainment. Around this time, Jason received emails from people claiming to have had experiences after hearing about the Dybbuk Box for the first time. He ignored most of them, until the similarities became impossible to dismiss. The dreams were the same. The sensation of wood pressing inward, the sense of waiting, the presence of a woman nearby. Exhausted, angry, resigned. Jason understood then that the original woman associated with the box wasn't haunting anyone. She was guarding something. And guarding comes at a cost. In Kabbalistic tradition, binding rituals are not permanent solutions. They are agreements, contracts based on balance. Something is contained. Something is sacrificed. What was sacrificed in this case wasn't life. It was peace. Jason believed the woman had taken on the role of watcher, a human anchor tied to the boundary. Her suffering wasn't the origin of the Dybbuk. It was the price of keeping it still. That reframed the entire narrative. The Dybbuk wasn't the only presence. It wasn't alone. And that made it far more dangerous, because it meant containment depended on memory. as long as the story was told carefully, as long as it wasn't sensationalized, as long as it wasn't treated as a challenge, the balance held. But balance is fragile. Jason became increasingly concerned about the way the story spread online. Clickbait, mockery, replicas, people daring each other to open boxes for views. He suspected those acts didn't summon anything new. They weakened something old. Every joke stripped weight from the warning. Every dare chipped away at restraint. Jason once wrote privately that the Dybbuk Box was less like a curse and more like a pressure system. Stable when respected, violent when ignored. That idea lingered with him for years. Then came the incident he never publicly discussed. One night, Jason woke up convinced someone was standing in his room, not looming, not threatening, waiting. He felt a sense of expectation so heavy it pinned him to the bed. Not fear, responsibility, as if something was reminding him of an agreement he hadn't consciously made. He didn't see anything, but he understood. The box didn't want to be opened. It wanted to be remembered correctly, not as entertainment, not as spectacle, as warning. Jason chose silence again after that night, and silence worked. But silence has limits, because stories don't belong to the people who try to contain them. They belong to the people who listen, and every listener adds weight, adds attention, adds pressure, which is why the Dybbuk Box doesn't need to move anymore. It doesn't need to be touched. It exists wherever the story is carried with enough focus, wherever curiosity outweighs caution, wherever someone thinks, what if it's real? That question is the door, and doors once imagined are hard to close. The Dybbuk doesn't rush. It waits, because waiting has always worked. There was another pattern Jason didn't want to admit at first. The Dybbuk didn't react to disbelief. It reacted to certainty. People who laughed at the story and dismissed it outright often experienced nothing at all. No dreams, no fear, no disturbance. But the moment disbelief turned into curiosity, something changed. Curiosity is not neutral. Curiosity is engagement. Jason noticed that people who said, "I don't believe this, but," were the ones who later reached out to him in private, the ones who couldn't sleep, the ones who felt watched when they were alone. Because doubt still opens the door. It doesn't slam it shut. And that made the Dybbuk different from every other horror story. It didn't thrive on belief. It thrived on focus. Jason began comparing the Dybbuk Box phenomenon to something more familiar. Contagion, not biological, cognitive. Ideas spreading through attention, not contact. Once the story entered someone's mind, it didn't stay passive. It reorganized itself around whatever cracks already existed there. Stress, grief, isolation, uncertainty. The Dybbuk didn't create suffering. It settled into it. That explained why the experiences varied so widely. Some people felt terror, others felt sadness, some felt obsession, others felt exhaustion. It wasn't imposing a single emotion, it was amplifying what was already present. Jason started to believe that the original containment ritual wasn't designed to trap a single entity. It was designed to limit propagation, to slow the spread, and it worked for a time. But modern life made containment harder. Stories travel faster now. Attention is constant, silence is rare. Every retelling sharpened the image. Every description made it more real. Jason realized that even academic discussion carried risk. Neutral analysis still fed awareness. Even careful language could become a vector. He withdrew further, but the story didn't. People continued reporting experiences after casual exposure. Someone would hear the story in passing, then dream of confinement weeks later. Someone else would stumble across it late at night and wake up with an unexplained sense of dread. Not fear of the box, fear of being watched. Jason wondered if the Dybbuk even needed the original narrative anymore, or if it had learned to exist purely as a sensation, a feeling, a pressure. That thought unsettled him deeply, because sensations don't require belief. You don't have to believe in pain to feel it. You don't have to believe in fear to experience it. You just have to be open. Jason returned to the ancient texts one last time, not looking for solutions, looking for patterns. He found a passage rarely discussed. It described Dybbuks not as invaders, but as echoes, fragments of something unresolved that persist until balance is restored. The text didn't describe banishment. It described endurance. Live without feeding it. Live without acknowledging it. Live without giving it shape. But that solution only works if everyone participates, and people don't. Someone always looks back. Someone always wonders. Someone always opens the box again, even if only in their mind. That's why the Dybbuk persists. Not because it's powerful, but because it's patient. Jason eventually stopped researching entirely. He avoided interviews, declined invitations, let the story move without him. And for a long time it did, quietly. But stories don't disappear. They wait for the right conditions. Late at night, when the mind is tired, when curiosity feels harmless, that's when they resurface. The Dybbuk Box doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It exists in the question people ask themselves when they're alone. What if it's real? That question doesn't feel dangerous. It feels natural. And that's the problem, because every time it's asked, the boundary flexes. Not enough to break, just enough to remind whatever is contained that it's still being thought about, still remembered, still relevant. Jason once wrote that the worst thing you can do with a story like this isn't to believe it. It's to obsess over it. Obsession turns caution into fixation. Fixation turns boundaries into invitations. And invitations don't require words. They only require attention, which is why this story keeps going. Not because it needs to be finished, but because finishing it would require everyone to stop listening at once. And that never happens. There is always someone else, someone hearing it for the first time, someone replaying it, someone thinking about it longer than they should. And every one of those moments adds weight, adds pressure, adds presence. The Dybbuk doesn't need a box anymore. It needs awareness. And awareness is everywhere. Jason eventually came to a realization that unsettled him more than any symptom he had experienced. The Dybbuk Box never acted urgently. Everything about it was slow. The dreams didn't arrive all at once. The fear didn't spike suddenly. The influence didn't overwhelm immediately. It accumulated, like pressure building behind a wall. That meant time was on its side. Whatever had been bound inside the box didn't measure existence in days or years. It measured it in attention cycles, in moments of focus, in repeated thoughts. Jason noticed that people who experienced the strongest effects weren't the ones who encountered the story briefly. They were the ones who lingered, who replayed details, who searched for explanations, who tried to map logic onto something that resisted being mapped. The Dybbuk didn't punish curiosity. It rewarded persistence. That distinction mattered because curiosity fades quickly. Persistence doesn't. Persistence becomes fixation. Fixation becomes invitation. Jason began to suspect that the original binding ritual didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because the world changed. When the box was first sealed, stories traveled slowly. Knowledge stayed local. Warnings stayed within communities that respected them. Now stories move instantly. Now attention multiplies. Now restraint is rare. Jason once compared the Dybbuk Box to a pressure vessel designed for a quieter age. It wasn't built to withstand constant observation. No containment is. That explained why replicas began behaving strangely, even without any deliberate ritual attached to them. The shape itself had become symbolic. The idea of a sealed box containing something that should not be released carried enough weight to function as a boundary, and boundaries attract pressure. Jason reviewed footage of people opening replica boxes online. Most laughed, some mocked. A few became visibly uncomfortable without understanding why. Those were the ones who later reported dreams. Not immediately. Weeks later. Sometimes months. The delay mattered. It meant the Dybbuk didn't react impulsively. It embedded. People reported changes they couldn't pinpoint, increased irritability, difficulty sleeping, a sense that their thoughts weren't entirely private anymore. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would send them to a doctor. Just enough to feel wrong. Jason realized that the Dybbuk wasn't inserting thoughts. It was amplifying existing ones. That's why no two experiences were identical. It wasn't controlling, it was resonating, like a tuning fork struck against the right frequency. That also explained why people under emotional stress were affected more deeply. Stress destabilizes mental boundaries. It makes the mind more porous. The Dybbuk didn't need force. It needed access. Jason stopped trying to define the entity as evil. That word implied intent, malice, cruelty. This felt different. This felt mechanical, like a system designed to persist, a process that reacted to input and produced output. Attention in, Influence out, Jason became increasingly convinced that the Dybbuk Box wasn't created to imprison a single spirit. It was created to demonstrate a method, a way to contain something that couldn't be destroyed. A lesson passed down through ritual rather than explanation. The lesson wasn't how to defeat a Dybbuk. It was how to live around one. Containment through restraint, safety through distance, survival through humility. The moment those principles were ignored, the system destabilized. Jason noticed that people who tried to confront the story directly, who sought proof, who demanded answers, experienced the strongest backlash. The story didn't tolerate being cornered. It tolerated being respected. That was the part modern audiences struggled with. Respect without understanding feels unsatisfying. We want closure. We want explanation. We want to open the box and see what's inside. Jason believed that impulse was the real danger, because opening the box was never about curiosity, it was about control, and the Dybbuk existed precisely because control had already failed once. Jason often wondered what had happened to the original woman who sealed the box. Not her spirit, her life. What kind of existence is required to bind something knowing it won't end with you? What kind of responsibility does that create? He suspected her suffering wasn't caused by the Dybbuk. It was caused by the knowledge that containment is never permanent, that one day someone else would come along and undo what she had done, not out of malice, out of curiosity. That made her story tragically human, just enough to remind whatever is waiting that it hasn't been forgotten. And that reminder matters more than people realize, because waiting doesn't mean weakness. Waiting means time is on its side. The Dybbuk was never desperate. It never needed to rush. It never needed to force itself into the world the way people imagine evil does. Everything about it suggested patience, a confidence that came from knowing that humans repeat the same mistakes generation after generation. Jason began to understand that the box was only dangerous when people tried to define it too clearly, when they tried to label it as a demon, a ghost, or a curse. Labels made people curious. Curiosity made people careless. Carelessness loosened boundaries, and boundaries were the only thing keeping everything in place. That's why nothing catastrophic ever happened all at once. There was no single moment of destruction, no dramatic outbreak of violence, no undeniable proof that would force people to stop and take the warning seriously. Instead, there were patterns, small disruptions, unexplainable fear, a sense of being watched that never quite crossed into certainty. Enough to unsettle, never enough to convince, because convincing people would end the cycle. And the cycle is the point. Jason noticed that people who tried to face the story head-on often fared worse than those who walked away early. Facing it implied challenge. Challenge implied confrontation, and confrontation implied attention. The Dybbuk didn't respond to confrontation, it responded to persistence. To the people who stayed up late thinking about it, to the ones who replayed details in their minds, to the ones who kept asking themselves why it felt so personal. Those were the ones who felt it linger, the pressure, the weight, the sense that something unfinished had brushed past their thoughts and left a mark. Jason stopped seeing the Dybbuk Box as a threat and started seeing it as a test, not of belief, of restraint. A test most people failed without realizing they were even taking it. Because restraint doesn't feel heroic. It feels unsatisfying. It feels like walking away without answers. It feels like closing a door without knowing what's on the other side. Humans hate that feeling. We crave resolution. We crave explanation. We crave the moment where the lid is lifted and everything makes sense. And that craving is exactly what keeps the boundary under pressure. Jason accepted that the box would outlive him, that the story would move on without him, that no amount of documentation or warning would permanently solve the problem. The best he could do was slow it down. Add friction. Remind people that some things don't become safer just because we understand them better. Some things become more dangerous the longer we stare at them. And that's the quiet truth buried inside this story. The Dybbuk Box doesn't need to be open to matter. It doesn't need to be touched to follow you. It doesn't even need to be believed in. It only needs to be remembered, because remembrance is participation, and participation is how the waiting continues. And participation has a cost, even when it feels passive. Jason noticed that people who brushed off their experiences often did so by rationalizing them. Stress, bad sleep, coincidence, overactive imagination. Those explanations worked, temporarily, but they didn't erase the memory of how it felt when the pressure first appeared. Memory is stubborn. It doesn't disappear when dismissed. It waits for context. Months later, sometimes years later, something small would trigger it. A dark room, the smell of old wood, a passing mention of the story, and the sensation would return, not as fear, but as recognition. That recognition was the most unsettling part, because it felt earned. Jason believed the Dybbuk didn't attach itself to people. It attached itself to moments, to mental states, to the spaces where certainty thinned out and the mind wandered without direction. Late nights, quiet rooms, moments when the world felt just slightly out of focus. Those were the places it lingered. He compared it to a draft you only notice when you stop moving. While life is loud, fast, and distracting, it stays at the edges. But when things slow down, when attention finally has nowhere else to go, it slips closer, not to scare, to be acknowledged. Jason once tried to explain this to someone who asked him why he never fully denounced the story as fiction. He struggled to find the words. Then he said something simple: because denial is still engagement. That sentence carried weight. Denial argues. Arguing focuses. Focusing feeds. Indifference is the only thing that starves it. But indifference is difficult to maintain in a world built to reward curiosity. People don't stumble into stories like this by accident. Algorithms suggest them. Conversations drift toward them. Late-night boredom opens the door. And once the door is open, even a crack, the boundary flexes again. Not enough to fail, just enough to remind whatever is waiting that it hasn't been forgotten. Jason came to believe that the original woman who sealed the box understood this better than anyone. Her ritual wasn't a show of power. It was an act of discipline, a promise to keep something contained even when it would be easier to look away. That kind of discipline doesn't age well. It requires continuity across generations, shared restraint, collective memory that resists temptation. And humans are not good at that. We inherit warnings without the fear that made them necessary. We receive stories stripped of consequence. We hear the rules, but never the reasons. So we test them. We open what was closed. We question what was settled. We assume danger must announce itself loudly to be real. The Dybbuk Box never needed volume. It relied on patience. Jason accepted that he would never know if containment truly worked. There was no signal for success, no confirmation, only the absence of escalation. And absence is hard to trust. That uncertainty followed him everywhere. It shaped how he lived. He avoided fixation. He avoided repetition. He avoided revisiting the story when he felt himself slipping into that familiar pull, because he understood something most people never do. Curiosity doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like a reflex. And reflexes are easy to exploit. The Dybbuk didn't need believers. It didn't need followers. It didn't need fear. It needed minds willing to circle the same thought again and again. That's how it persisted. That's how it waited. And that's why this story doesn't end cleanly. There is no final act where the box is destroyed and the danger disappears. There is no moment of victory. There is only management, distance, restraint, and the quiet decision not to lean closer. Because some stories don't want to be finished. They want to be revisited. And every revisit makes them a little heavier, a little clearer, a little closer. Which is why the most important moment in this story isn't when the box was opened. It's right now. The moment you decide what you do next, whether you sit with the discomfort and let it pass, or whether you turn it over in your mind one more time. Because that choice, small as it feels, is the boundary. And boundaries only hold as long as we respect them. Most people don't realize when they cross a boundary. There's no sound, no warning, no clear moment where you can say, this is where it changed. It feels gradual, natural, almost reasonable. Jason understood that the Dybbuk didn't wait for dramatic weakness. It waited for fatigue, for the moment when a person stopped guarding their thoughts because guarding them took too much effort. That's when the mind becomes permissive, not open. Permissive. Permissive minds don't invite anything in. They simply stop keeping things out. Jason saw this in himself during the years after he stepped away from the box. On nights when he was overtired, stressed, or alone with nothing but his thoughts, the story resurfaced without his permission. Not images, not fear. Questions. What if the box was opened again? What if someone did it differently this time? What if containment only worked because people believed it did? Those questions never arrived fully formed. They drifted in, incomplete, easy to ignore, unless he engaged them. And engagement was the danger. Jason learned to let those questions pass the way you let background noise fade, not by fighting them, but by refusing to follow them. That discipline didn't come naturally. It had to be practiced, because the Dybbuk didn't exploit ignorance. It exploited focus. People often assume that awareness is protection, that knowing about something dangerous makes you safer. But Jason learned the opposite can be true. Awareness without restraint is exposure. That's why the people most affected by the Dybbuk Box weren't the uninformed. They were the informed. The ones who knew just enough to keep thinking about it. The ones who felt compelled to connect dots that weren't meant to be connected. Jason once compared it to standing at the edge of a deep well. Looking down once doesn't matter. Looking down repeatedly changes something in you. Depth starts to feel familiar. Distance starts to shrink. Eventually, you don't notice how close you're standing. That's when accidents happen. The Dybbuk thrived in that narrowing gap between caution and fixation. Jason also noticed something else that disturbed him deeply. People rarely talked about their experiences out loud. They carried them privately because there was nothing concrete to describe. No proof. No event dramatic enough to justify concern. Just sensations. A sense of pressure, a feeling of being observed when no one was there. Dreams that felt heavier than ordinary dreams. Those experiences didn't fit neatly into language, and what can't be expressed tends to linger. It loops. Jason believed that looping was part of the mechanism. Thoughts circling without resolution. Attention returning again and again to the same point. That's how the Dybbuk maintained presence without presence, not through manifestation, through recurrence. He started to see the Dybbuk Box as less of a prison and more of a reminder, a physical representation of a rule that most people forget. Some things don't become safer when examined closely. Some things become more entrenched. Jason stopped hoping the story would fade. Instead, he hoped it would slow down, that people would grow bored, that curiosity would move on to something louder, faster, easier to consume. Boredom was safer than fear. Fear sharpens attention. Boredom dissolves it, but boredom doesn't last forever. Something always resurfaces. A new article, a new video, a new retelling framed just differently enough to feel fresh, and with every retelling, the boundary flexes again. Not enough to fail, just enough to remind whatever is waiting that it hasn't been forgotten. Jason accepted that the Dybbuk would likely outlast him. Outlast everyone who tried to manage it, because it didn't depend on individuals. It depended on patterns. And humans are nothing if not predictable. We return to the things that unsettle us. We revisit the questions without answers. We lean closer to the edge to see if the drop is really that far. The Dybbuk Box didn't need to push. It only needed to wait, because waiting has always worked. Jason stopped trying to warn people after a while. Warnings sound like challenges to the wrong ears. They provoke curiosity instead of caution. He realized that the more clearly he explained the danger, the more people leaned in, wanting to test themselves against it. So he changed his approach. He stopped explaining what the Dybbuk Box was and started paying attention to how people reacted when they heard about it. Some laughed, some dismissed it, some listened quietly and never brought it up again. Those were the ones he worried about the least. The ones who troubled him were the people who went silent and thoughtful. The ones whose eyes lingered just a little too long, as if something in the story had settled into place inside them. Because silence doesn't always mean disbelief. Sometimes it means recognition. Jason believed that whatever was associated with the Dybbuk Box recognized itself in certain people, not because they were weak, but because they were reflective, introspective, the kind of people who turn thoughts over and over in their minds until they feel worn smooth. Reflection creates depth. Depth creates space. And space is where things linger. He once described the Dybbuk as an echo that learned how to listen. It didn't shout to be heard. It waited for quiet moments, for mental stillness, for the kind of silence where even a whisper would feel loud. That's when it pressed closest, not violently, intimately. That intimacy was what frightened him most, not possession, not control, familiarity. Because familiarity dulls fear, and once fear dulls, restraint weakens. Jason came to accept that the Dybbuk Box story would never truly end, not because the entity was powerful, but because humans are cyclical. We forget, we rediscover, we repeat. Every generation believes it's the first to ask certain questions. Every generation believes it's smarter, safer, more rational than the last. And every generation opens something it was warned about. The box itself may never be opened again, but the idea of it already has been. Repeatedly, quietly. You don't need to touch old wood to feel the weight of this story. You don't need to stand in front of a sealed container to sense the pressure it represents. All you need is a moment of stillness, a moment where your thoughts slow down and drift back to it, to the image of something closed for a reason, to the feeling that some boundaries exist not to trap what's inside, but to protect what's outside. That's the part people miss. The Dybbuk Box was never about unleashing evil. It was about restraint, about choosing not to know everything, about accepting that some doors stay closed, not because we're afraid of what's behind them, but because opening them changes us in ways we can't undo. Jason lived the rest of his life with that understanding. He didn't obsess. He didn't revisit. He let the story pass when it surfaced and refused to carry it further than necessary. That refusal mattered because attention is never harmless and curiosity is never free. So now the story reaches its quiet end, not with destruction or revelation, but with a choice. The same choice every person who hears this story eventually faces. You can keep turning it over in your mind. You can replay details. You can wonder how much of it was real. Or you can let it rest, not because you're afraid, but because you understand. Some things don't need to be open to prove they matter. Some stories don't need answers to leave an impression. And some boxes were sealed, not to hide what's inside, but to remind us that restraint is sometimes the only thing standing between curiosity and consequence. And that reminder is enough. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, if it made you pause, even for a moment, that's what DarkStory Lab is about. Here, we don't chase loud horror. We explore the kind that lingers, the kind rooted in real stories, real warnings, and real human curiosity. If you want more true horror stories like this, stories that don't rely on monsters but on the choices people make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you want the next story, let me know by hitting like and sharing this with someone who listens late at night. This is Jake. Thank you for being here. And remember, some stories end, but they never really leave.